Hello, everybody. My name is Eric Haas, and I'm going to present for the November DevDays, the Argonaut 2020 patient lists. First, a little about me. My name is Eric Haas. I'm a veterinarian, master's in chemistry, and I am basically a consultant and have worked with the Argonaut project from almost the very beginning. I'm also deeply involved in FHIR at HL7 and the author of several implementation guides. I can be reached, most easiest way to reach me would be through my email, which is here, or you can find me on the FHIR Zulip chat as well. Okay, let's get started. Every year, the Argonaut project, which is composed of several major US vendors and hospitals and other interested parties, comes together and they select a few projects to start off and kick off and work on through the year. In 2020, one of the projects was the patient list projects. And we're going to go over the scope of that project, some of the background and why it was chosen, as well as spend a fair amount of time on a sketch of the API, looking what we've discovered over the last several months. We'll look at some implementation experience. I'll give a brief demo to kind of show off the API, and then go over a roadmap of where we've been, where we are, and where we're going, looking at a few of the next steps, and finally closing out with a set of resources you can explore after this presentation. So first of all, the patient list project scope. We spent the first month or two just kind of hammering out a scope, and our goal really turns out to be to support an interoperable and standard way to exchange the existing EHR user-facing patient list. So we want to use FHIR and develop a FHIR API so that a third-party app can basically get access to existing user-facing lists. And we use the word EHR here as basically the data source, where basically our model is the EHR. It doesn't have to be an EHR, but that's what we're basing it upon. Now we have two types of lists we're talking about that exist in EHRs today. We have the so-called system-generated list, the list generated by the EHR, and then we have these custom user-generated lists. Basically, these are lists that have been annotated and enumerated by some user and are sitting on the system. An example of a system-generated list would be, for example, a calendar showing the day's appointments, and a user-generated list is more of a custom list, and maybe the patient said Dr. Jones wants to follow up on. For the scope, we have determined that writing and creating lists kind of on the fly from the client side is out of scope. And overall, all this work is towards developing an API, testing it out, and then having a final work product that'll be an implementation guide. A little bit more about the background. User-facing apps often want to know things like, what patients am I seeing today? Who are the patients I'm responsible for in the hospital right now? Or who are the patients in this ward? Generically, a rounds list, for example. And this core functionality isn't anything new. It's already supported by EHR systems today. And in fact, in the first part of our project, we kind of did a survey of what's already out there to kind of get a kind of a good notion of what we're going after. However, no standard-based guidance for creation and manipulation of patient lists currently exists. Everything is basically a custom app and a one-off solution. So we looked to FHIR to give us this standards-based interoperable approach to exposing existing lists. And there's several options out there we looked at initially. The first one is just basically the FHIR search API. Just search for a set of patients based on a set of criteria. And then we also looked at assembling patients in prepackaged resources, such as the list resource or the group resource. And after a few rounds of discussion, we developed a sketch and outline of an API where we have patient lists existing in the data source, in the EHR, as FHIR group resources. And we'll go over a couple of reasons why we chose the group resource over, for example, the list resource. So overall, we're going to want to discover what user-facing lists that me as a client have access to. And once we have that, we can select one of those lists and we can fetch it, and we can have expose or somehow use the information on that list. And thirdly, we can fetch additional data about each patient on that list, because oftentimes you just don't want a list of IDs for a patient. You want to have more information about that patient, and we've looked at several ways of getting that additional information. Okay, so remember, this is important to remember because the project is called Patient Lists, but for Patient Lists, we're using the FHIR group resource. So think group resource. When we say list, we mean the group resource. And for our use case, the group lists members, there's an element in there which would be a Boolean saying actual equals true, and the members reference patients using their logical FHIR IDs. Let's look at a picture of that here. So here's the UML diagram from the FHIR specification. You can see the group resource here. And for that group, there's 0 to many members, and that member is basically a reference to a patient in our case. And the group can be characterized by a set of characteristics, which is one of the reasons we chose group, because you can use a set of, for example, a set of codes to a set of name value pairs, as a matter of fact, to describe the membership of that group. There's also a managing entity on that group that describes who owns the group. And then also, I mentioned before, we have a little Boolean in there flag that actually equals true, which says we're going to enumerate this list. We want to have enumerated lists that both have characteristics that define who's on a list, but also enumerated lists. We don't want to have just a virtual list. We want to have actual members on that list. Okay, so the first step in our API is discovery. And we're going to use a group resource, and we want to have the ability to search by characteristics, for example, by a location, by, the membership on this group is defined by a certain location. It can be defined by a certain practitioner, organization, or a certain care team. We also want to be able to discover lists and be able to filter the lists by the ability to search by the manager. Who's managing this list? What entity is managing this list? And also, we also want to limit the size. When we think about discovery, we're thinking about getting a list of all the lists. So it's actually a list of lists, a group of lists, or a bundle of lists of a patient list. We want to just see what lists are available to me. So we're not trying to get the actual members in this step. We're just trying to see what lists are available to me. Do I have I may have several lists that I can look at, and there may be 1 or 2 I'm interested in, but I want to look at all the lists. I want to look at the list by a certain characteristic that's described by the group resource, or I want to look by a certain who's managing the list. And so we have an idea of a summary search. So we don't enumerate all the members of all the different lists. We just want to get a kind of a summary of each list so we can select the list. Here's an example of an example search syntax for getting all the available lists from an EHR. So we get the group, the summary equals true, and here we have the type as a person, because we only want the kind of lists that are patient lists. We don't want to get lists that have other types. For example, I guess practitioners would be another type of list, or other types of entities. And then the characteristic code. Excuse me, in the search we have a name value pair, so the characteristic, and then we have the value of that characteristic. So the characteristic, for example, could be location. So characteristic equals location, and the value reference would reference a particular location. Say I want all the lists that are available for patients with a characteristic of being at location Hospital West, or I don't know, Clinic B. And just a little note there, value reference is really not available in FHIR R4, and that's a custom search parameter that we'll be implementing in our implementation guide, which is an R4 guide, and we have a tracker to add that particular search parameter to FHIR R5. So once you get a list of lists, what lists you have access to, you pick one of those lists by the ID, the group ID, and then you basically can fetch that. It's a simple fetch operation. There's not much to this second step. You basically do a simple fetch, FHIR fetch, you get the list, and you get a list of members. And so, are we done at this step? Well, maybe if that's all you really want is to get the list and just list out the members, that's great. But typically we need more data about the patient. And here's just a little figure to just kind of point this out. We have a list of patients, my patient. So what you get from the group resource is you get the ID, the second column there. You might get, display element that may say that who it is, the patient, but oftentimes you have to do a subsequent queries to get the other columns in this row: patient, date of birth, sex, etc., etc. So in the third part of our API, we're going to discuss how to get more data about the patient. So we want to fetch additional data about each patient, and the simplest approach to this is to just do a simple series of queries on a server to fetch the additional data. So for example, for each patient in a list, each patient in the group resource, for each member, we're going to, for example, get that patient by the ID. So we'll get the actual patient resource. And then we want to go back and get, for example, an observation. We want to get maybe the latest observation, latest lab observations for each patient, because we want to fill out, imagine if you're going to fill out a spreadsheet or a chart for each patient on that list. Sometimes doing a patient-based query is not going to get you where you want to go. Sometimes it fails because the information just isn't in a FHIR resource, or there's not a query you can do to get the information you need. So in those cases, we have come up with a couple of solutions for a couple of situations where basically a simple query is not going to get you what you want. So, for example, you might have a list that's based on a specific encounter or appointment that defines the group membership. And doing a query or having a set of characteristics really isn't feasible. So we wanted to create an extension that allows you to reference an encounter or a specific encounter or appointment that defines the membership on that group. So basically you have a group. For each group member, you have an extension that references a specific encounter or appointment, which defines why that patient's on a group. For example, the appointment for each patient I'm seeing today. In another case, we have fetching additional data using questionnaires. It's a little more involved because you have a questionnaire that defines the data that you're going to provide for each member, each patient on that list. And then for each member in that list, in the group, there is a group.member. Each group.member, we have an extension that references the filled out data, supplying the patient data defined in that questionnaire. So imagine if you have a questionnaire that's on the group resource that defines the data, and then for each member, you reference a questionnaire response. That's basically a filled out form giving you the information. And it's important to note that the questionnaire response is filled out by the server, by the data source. It's not filled out by a patient. This is a pre-filled form. It's just supplying you with the data that you've defined on the questionnaire. Okay, here's a use case for specialized care, off-hours care that shows how remote care management could use a patient list and using with questionnaires and questionnaire responses attached to that list. So say you have a remote clinician, he's not next to the patient, and you're supplying him with data to monitor several patients. For example, you may have an after-hours clinic, a use case for specialized care, maybe off-hours care, and you have remote monitoring, and you want to gather you want to have a way to collect all this information from in this example, this is from Epic, and I want to thank them for this content. You have an Epic external Epic site or non-external Epic sites. You have a standard way of getting this data and collecting, so you can have a way to monitor patients remotely. And it's a way to help For example, if there's an overflow or a surge capacity, maybe help to monitor extra patients in other facilities, or even to expand business. So you have these monitors that are monitoring all these patients remotely, and at the core, at the upper left, the patient list with the details about each individual patient. And the source site can capture and calculate relevant metrics in a timely manner, and you can upload those metrics into that list and repeatedly poll or get new information. In this way, you can have a kind of a dashboard that gives you the overview, and then if you see changes in that list, you can maybe take and one of the other monitors, look at that patient's record, for example, get a video feed and do an EMR. So that patient list up in the corner will be kind of like your command central, your data center. And so you could have this heads-up display, which has, for example, these are the kind of information you may want to have in your patient list in addition to the patient. Scoring, you may have a chart, for example, maybe some alerts, and then just some other information, name, date, age, problem, and so forth. So just to remind you, in this case, we're thinking about imagine the questionnaire defining all these columns of data, and then the questionnaire response is the vehicle for giving you that information that's attached to each patient in the list. Okay, so I'm going to switch over now to just go through, briefly go over where we've been. This is where we've been and what we've gone to. So we've gone through most of the year working on all these solutions and developing and clarifying this API. So we did have a Connect-a-thon on the 25th of September. We had several participants, including Cerner, Meditech, Microsoft, clients, including Apple, Epic, Microsoft, and we had a couple test apps. And by the way, I do want to thank Epic for that test case and the previous slides, which I'm thankful for them to help me provide this to help explain the use case. So we were able to demonstrate basically at our Connect-a-thon, we were able to demonstrate the basic proof of concept for the API we've just discussed for both clients and server. We've identified several issues, and we certainly think that there are several things that we can look at the next Connect-a-thon, which is going to be one of our next steps I'll be talking about here in a minute. I want to switch gears here and try to give you a live demonstration. This is a little client app that we have. I'm just going to do a quick turnaround here. We're just going to walk through the API really quickly with this demonstration. I'm going to run this really quickly. So here we have our patient list, so we're going to discover some lists. Patient can go through this fairly briefly. So the first step was discovery or summary of patient lists. So we want to discover our list. We choose a server. We're going to stick with the test server at Happy, and we're going to click off it. We're going to fetch all user-facing lists. We're just going to get all the lists here. And as part of our Connect-a-thon experience, we discovered we need more lists. So we did go out and we created a few lists. So I have several lists in here. I'm just going to pick one at random here. So we have this location, characteristic-based location list right here. And we'll go ahead and we'll click on that. And I will fetch these user-facing lists. And by the way, in this little app, which I have a link to down there, it does show you the calls, the bundle that it returns, and it shows the fetch. And so if we fetch a single list, basically we're going to get this list. It's going to return the list, and we're going to be able to list out all the patients on that list. And of course, down below here in this little app, we have the raw format as well. If you want to take a look at that in your free time, there's links to this app. So now we want to fetch additional data about this list. So I'm going to click on here. We're going to click on there. We're going to get the ability to fetch additional data. So here we have just a very simple app. I'm going to get additional data about this first patient here. So if I click on that, it sort of fill out that first column. Now you can do this in different ways. We discussed, just not doing it on one-off each patient. You can do a multiple ORs. So you can collect patients using different fetch criteria. For example, using the comma separated IDs would do it. You can do a rev include. And so we have that in this app. We have several different ways of doing this. You can use a batch functionality to get them all. We can do something using something called rev include to get all the patient resources with the list. And then we have the extra details via questionnaire. So here's a little list of the patients. And here's a questionnaire that I defined just for demonstration purposes. So if I click on here, we have the questionnaire. Looks something. This questionnaire basically defines. It's a flat questionnaire, defines a few data points, and then using that, we're gonna have to go back here. Let's see. I don't happen to my. There we go. Okay. Okay, good. Using that, we're going to click on one of these patients, and again, it reads the questionnaire and it comes back and it returns it with a questionnaire response resource. Click down here and we'll come back here. So it fills all that information. So what's really happening in the background is just this resource is packed with all kinds of extensions. And so we have this extension, which returns the resource. And so what I did, the actual artifact contains, I should go back here and look for it. The actual artifact contains all the references. And so what I basically did here was I basically click on this and it basically fetches the questionnaire response resource and it fills in the columns. So that was kind of the basic functionality we were looking for initially. And I have, like, you know, things you can actually do with RESTful searches, but you can imagine having calculated values, things you can't normally get from just a RESTful search. This is very basic proof of concept. And so that's basically the demo in a nutshell. But that we're going to build on that in our next Connectathon. So far in our roadmap, we obviously we kicked it off. We're here in the check mark. We're in the October-December phase. We're kind of, you know, cleaning up the documentation and working on an IG and preparing for a second Connectathon. As far as our next steps, we like I mentioned, we're going to have another Connectathon in January. We welcome any new participants. We're going to look at more testing capacity. We're building out the number of lists available, group resources available to test them. We're going to focus on getting that additional data using question response. We're going to look at what happens when the lists get kind of large. Excuse me. When the lists get larger, it may become more of a bulk data operation than a synchronous, you know, RESTful interchange. And so we're going to try to look at a little bit of those boundaries between, you know, bulk data and doing the FHIR interactions synchronously. And finally, we'll be talking about the other extension, getting encounters and appointments that define the membership on the list using the extensions. Also, next step is we're, like I said, working on polishing up the documentation and getting the implementation guide together. And after more implementation experience, we're going to hand it off to HL7 for publishing as an HL7 IG. We're a bit conservative here. We want to get good implementer feedback before we go to publishing, so we have something that's more toothy and before we publish at HL7. Here's a list of patient resources. In addition to the slides here, we have some running meeting notes. A draft API. Down below, there's that little test app I showed. There's also a code lab exercise that's being developed and will be further developed for the next Connectathon. And if you have any questions, I appreciate the time for going. If you've been on followed this webinar this far, I want to thank you. And if you have any questions, you certainly can reach me. My links are on top, email or in FHIR chat. And with that, I'm going to wrap this up. And again, thank the sponsors of DevDays for this opportunity to be able to present our Argonaut 2020 Patient List Project. Thank you again.